Okay, so today, as Brother Tin mentioned, I already had the pleasure of speaking with Suchi back in March of this year. So this time I'm really happy to be back, and I'll be giving some updates on spotlighting a few environmental topics, particularly food systems, haze and air pollution, and plastic. And in particular, looking at Malaysia, since I'm based right now in Malaysia, but I work regionally on these issues as well across Southeast Asia. And I'll be giving a little bit of a review of some of the things that I mentioned last time, in case anyone was there last time I spoke, but also updates since then, and some of the latest developments that are going on right now related to these topics. So like I mentioned, yes, food systems, including industrial animal agriculture, industrial fishing, then air pollution and transboundary haze, and the third topic, the plastic crisis. And of course, solutions. Coming from Greenpeace, we really try to make sure that in addition to sharing with people a lot of the overwhelming and sometimes scary things that are happening right now related to the environment, it's important that everybody knows that we actually do have the solutions for these things. It's a question of political will and all of the important stakeholders taking action to do something and make sure we're actually using the solutions that we have. So I'll start off with the food systems topic and go through some of the big issues with industrial animal agriculture and industrial fishing. I think the first question that's important to answer is why food is so important to the environment. And many people might not realize how significant food is. It's something that food systems in general are responsible for 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions from humans. So it's actually really important when we talk about sustainability and addressing climate change. We have to change our food systems and the way we eat. And it's also something that we can do as individuals. Food production is one of the leading causes of biodiversity loss. It's also one of the major sources of pollution. And food systems take up about 30% of the global land surface used for farming. And it also requires 70% of global fresh water. So it's a very resource intensive industry that's why it's so important to help us when we look at climate change. So I want to talk in particular about animal agriculture and industrial animal agriculture, because this is responsible for the destruction of the world's most critical forests, including 80 to 90% of the Amazon, which is destroyed primarily for cattle and soy feedstock for animal agriculture. It's also a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions from methane, transport, land use change, and fresh water, like I mentioned, and also a significant contributor to pollution, including nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in our waterways. And I think this chart, it might look a little bit confusing, but it's really helpful to clarify why animal agriculture is so inefficient. So I really like to show this one, because if you look at the bottom part here, this is kind of outlining all of the land we have on the earth. And about 50% of habitable land is used for agriculture. Then when you look at the parts of land, the land used for agriculture, about 77% of it is used for livestock, for meat and dairy. Only about 23% is used for plant-based crops that are directly for human consumption. But the problem is that the portion, the 77% or almost 80% of land used for livestock is actually only providing us with around 18% of our calories. So it's massively inefficient when you think about it. And this is because, of course, to raise animals, we have to feed them for their entire lives. So it requires growing crops for the entire life of an animal to feed the animal. And then that provides one meal for a human. But you can imagine that's taking up a lot of land for feedstock as well as the animal. And that's why it's really inefficient. And it's much better if we focus on plant-based crops in terms of land use. We could be saving huge amounts of land and producing the same amount of food if we were eating more plant-based food. And you can see also that in terms of protein supply, most of the world's protein supply still comes from plant-based food, even though most of the land is used for animals, animal agriculture. So yeah, it's important for people to also know that we can get protein from plants, and animals get protein from plants. So it's possible and something that we need to try to do more of in terms of the environment, to protect the environment and to stop climate change. So this is something that scientists have been saying is really necessary. Just one other chart to emphasize this, the huge difference between the impact of animal-based foods to plant-based foods. You can see that around 7 out of 10 of the most emissions-intensive foods are animal-based, particularly beef and dairy. Beef has more than double the emissions of any other food. But also other meats are usually in the top, like lamb and mutton, cheese, shrimp, pork, poultry are all in the top 10. And this is a more recent update. Just in July 2023, there was a study released that has claimed to be the most comprehensive study to date, looking at vegan diets compared to high meat eating diets. And the findings showed that plant-based diets produce 75% less heat trapping gas, so greenhouse gas emissions, 75% less water pollution, and they use 75% less land compared to high meat diets. And what I think was interesting is also that the way they considered, what they considered to be high meat diets, which I originally thought might be a lot, but actually it's 100 grams of meat daily, which is considered a lot of meat for human consumption, because we are not supposed to be eating so much meat. Even for people who believe that it's okay to eat meat, people are eating very high amounts these days. So you can see that the picture I put here, it's about the size of someone's palm, is 100 grams of meat daily, and that's already considered high consumption of meat. So this just shows that how significant it can be to reduce meat and cut out meat from your diet if you're able to. And the next part of this I just want to mention is about industrial fishing. Also because a lot of times, or sometimes, people who are trying to give up meat may think that eating fish is better or healthier. I actually used to do that when I was originally vegetarian and ate fish, and then I've learned a lot more since then. So now I'm fully vegan or plant-based after what I've learned about food systems. But industrial fishing is also extremely harmful for the environment and for humans. And that's because it's endangering species. It has led to 1/3 of fish populations collapsing since 1950. And industrial fishing often results in very large amounts of bycatch, which is when animals or fish are caught accidentally or in the same nets, but it's not the fish species that was intended to be caught, and they often are killed and dumped back into the ocean. So hundreds of thousands of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and sharks are killed each year, often as bycatch, but sometimes also intentionally, which is a problem because many of these species are endangered. And this is also destroying the ecosystem, and you can imagine the food system in the ocean is extremely disrupted by the way we fish. It's also destroying livelihoods and threatening food security, because hundreds of millions of people in coastal communities are reliant on fishing for survival. So industrial fishing is actually depleting the fish stocks and making it more difficult for communities that are really that struggle to survive without this to keep eating. It's also very harmful for workers, and Greenpeace is part of coalitions that are trying to raise awareness about modern slavery on fishing vessels, which is unfortunately still a very common practice. And the other thing that I think is important to highlight is that the ocean is really critical to climate change and our survival. And if we disrupt the ocean too much, if the ocean dies, we can't survive, because it's also critical to the storage and capture of carbon. So having healthy fish populations and healthy ocean is really necessary and important. And just to mention a little bit about why this fishing is so destructive, like I already mentioned a bit about bycatch, but there are many very destructive fishing practices that are legal. There's also illegal practices. IUU is the term we use for illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, which happens a lot, especially because you can imagine in the open seas, it's very difficult to monitor and enforce and regulate what's happening. So a lot of practices go unnoticed, and it's very difficult to make sure that safe practices are being used. So some of the destructive fishing practices that are common are bottom trawling, which is giant nets being pulled across the bottom of the sea, and they tend to destroy everything on the bottom of the ocean, including coral. So this is also a way that ecosystems are destroyed and coral reefs can be destroyed. Long lining is a practice of baiting thousands of hooks along miles of fishing lines. And again, this is another practice that catches everything that in its path, and often catches fish that are not intended to be caught. Of course, overfishing and fishing in protected areas is a problem, and fishing endangered species intentionally, which is something that still happens. And alongside this, we have the human rights issue, because you can imagine when these vessels are out at sea, and sometimes they stay at sea for years. And a lot of the workers on these fishing vessels are migrant workers. Many of them are from Southeast Asia. And there are lots of cases of abuse, payments being withheld, and sometimes fishers are even killed. And it's very difficult to do an investigation about what happened, because these ships are far out at sea. The workers have no access, no ability to get off, no ability to communicate. They do not have Wi-Fi or mobile connections out at sea. And so there's really no way for them to get away from this situation. And that's often why the abuse happens in the first place. And the other really interesting problem, or tragic problem, is that workers are often forced actually to use illegal fishing practices, even if it wasn't their original choice, because you can imagine the vessels that are often employing labor or abusing their laborers, they also don't care much about the environment. So they are also usually engaged in illegal fishing practices. All right, moving to the second topic today, I wanted to go a little bit beyond just food systems and talk about air pollution and haze, which is something we're seeing right now in Malaysia. The air pollution levels have been quite bad recently, and haze has been increasing, and it's something that we see regularly. So I just want to show this picture to show the contrast of KL. So I'm based here in KL, and in 2019, this was one of the worst haze seasons that happened in 2019, and you can see the difference, which is just really shocking. And I think something that we need to not allow to become normalized. I actually don't like the fact that it's called haze season as though it's a natural thing, but that's often what people refer to because every year haze is something that tends to come back. And it's not just in Malaysia, it's happening in many places in Southeast Asia. And at Greenpeace, we focus on this issue of transboundary haze, which we see across the Mekong region, and we see it a lot in Malaysia and Indonesia. So why is haze so bad? Well, we know it looks horrible. You can see it very clearly. And this is obviously because haze is air pollution, and it's one of the really bad contributors to air pollution. I want to talk a little bit about Malaysia in particular, where Greenpeace has done a study on this recently. And we found in 2022, Greenpeace India found that 100% of Malaysia's population was breathing unhealthy air, which is really devastating. This means that it's exceeding the World Health Organization's guidelines on PM 2.5 levels that are healthy. So we're unfortunately all breathing air that is not ideal. And then of course it gets worse at certain times, depending on the location you're in and what's going on. But this has a huge cost. So the cost of this that we identified is an estimated 32,000 avoidable deaths every year in Malaysia alone, and a financial loss estimated at 303 billion ringgit, which is 73 billion US dollars every year. And to put that into perspective, that amount represents about 20% of Malaysia's GDP in 2019. So this is a huge amount of money that is lost, and this financial loss is in considering all kinds of aspects, including healthcare costs, the need to shut down certain activities and industries during haze periods and when there's really bad air pollution, and other types of economic losses that this causes. And even when it doesn't lead to death, there are long-term health impacts from breathing in polluted air, and that includes chronic respiratory diseases, lung cancer, cardiovascular diseases such as stroke, diabetes, and high blood pressure. So these are things that we see more of, and you also see it in areas where the pollution is particularly bad. These types of diseases tend to have more prevalence. And of course, we know that air pollution comes from many sources. It comes from industrial manufacturing, burning of fossil fuels for power generation, vehicles, driving, there's lots of cars, open burning activities. But one area that we focus on in Greenpeace in particular is peatland burning, which is happening primarily in the context of Malaysia and Indonesia. It's often happening in Indonesia, and it's really important that we highlight that Malaysian companies are also contributing to it. And it's being financed by other international companies. There's lots of funding from Singapore, Malaysia, and other areas. So this is also why we really emphasize that it's a transboundary issue. It's not just an issue where we can say one country is responsible. It's globally financed, the industries that are causing this. And it's something that we really are calling on governments to manage their own country's participation in these activities that are causing haze. Because during the heavy haze in 2019, in Malaysia, we found that respiratory illnesses were the second leading cause of death at that time, which is really shocking, actually. And it's hard for people to understand the impact of this because it's very difficult to see the direct link. I mean, many people don't even realize they're breathing in such bad air. So like I mentioned, one of the areas that we focus on at Greenpeace is the reasons why peatland is being burned. And one of those in particular is for the palm oil industry. It's not only palm oil, it's also pulp and paper and timber that are contributing to burning of forests. But palm oil is a huge part of this. And it's a very prevalent product, where you see it in about 50% of all products in supermarkets. In Indonesia and Malaysia are the providers of around 85% of the global supply of palm oil. So that's also why it's one of the main causes in this region of deforestation. And these are really critical forests because, like I mentioned, they are peatlands, which are carbon sinks. They are able to store carbon in the soil even more than being captured by the trees and foliage above the ground. So that's why it's really, really important that we protect these forests, because they need to be protected for us to address climate change. And instead, right now, we are still seeing them being destroyed for money, essentially. Companies that have committed to stop deforestation for palm oil, they are still sourcing from deforestation. And Greenpeace unfortunately finds this every year. We are monitoring the burning and hotspots all across the region, and we see that it's happening in plantation areas that are sourcing big companies that have committed to not sourcing from deforestation. So unfortunately, it's still happening. There's still a lack of enforcement of the regulations that are there, and not strong enough enforcement and not enough transparency in the industry. So that's why this is also contributing to transboundary haze. So I wanted to show quickly what a kind of initiative that Greenpeace is taking right now to raise awareness about this. It's recently we've just published some very short videos called Invisible Cigarettes. So I wanted to play here. That's about 20 seconds. It should be really quick, but I think it's quite powerful, and hopefully you also find it. So we actually have 3 of them. The first one was about children, which are one of the most vulnerable populations to air pollution. The second one here is about elderly. And the final one, sorry, it's replaying. The final one here is highlighting the risks to pregnant people, who are also among the most vulnerable populations. So yeah, I just wanted to share those quickly because I think they're short, but they're quite powerful. And it also highlights, it's one of the ways we're trying to raise awareness about this. And you could see in the messaging that we are trying to inform people that regularly breathing haze with an API, air pollution index of 500, which has happened in Malaysia, could be equivalent to smoking around 23 cigarettes in a day. And what's also really scary to me is that even less than that, so long-term exposure to an API over 101 is considered unhealthy. And that itself may be comparable to smoking around 4.5 cigarettes per day. And if you have paid attention to the news recently, and if you're in Malaysia, the API has been over 100 almost every day recently. So this is really concerning because it means that we are breathing really unhealthy air, and it's as bad as smoking cigarettes in some cases, which I think we need to realize is something we should be addressing. And so what Greenpeace is doing about this is trying to pressure the government to push for a Transboundary Haze Pollution Act to hold Malaysian companies accountable for their involvement in activities that contribute to haze in particular. And hopefully we'll go even further than this. Of course, we're also really demanding that the government shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which would also reduce emissions from power generation and fuel consumption. But yeah, there's a lot of ways that we need to address this air pollution issue through changing our activities to more sustainable practices. And next, I wanted to also, there's a short video that Greenpeace Malaysia worked on, particularly related to transboundary haze issue. I think there's time for this one as well, because it's supposed to be a video trailer, like it's a teaser that will share a little bit more about the issue of the transboundary haze. And hopefully it's entertaining and also informative. So I'll play that now.
Semua unit, high alert. Dia makin dekat.
Dia lagi sangat.
Jadi lihat ambil di kolom kompor. Hanya 20 km dari pusat bandar. Orang ramai diarahkan tidak meninggalkan rumah. Ulangan, jangan keluar rumah. Oi Bahlul, kalau kita tak makan hutan dekat Sumatera, matilah kita kena dengan bos. Bila kena stop production, nanti rugi siapa nak tanggung? Peduli apa? Dia bukan masalah syarikat kita. Mampus masalah shit.
Sampai bila kita nak buat company negara kita bakar hutan Indonesia? Cukuplah tu menipu. Kita tak nak lagi jelebu. Tak nak jelebu. Tak nak jelebu. Tak nak jelebu.
Manusia tak bersyukur.
Kau ingat kau besar sangat ke?
Kita bantu rakyat. Kita bagi kerja. Kita bagi duit.
Duit tak boleh beli udara lah.
Duit boleh beli khidmat.
Sial.
So thanks for listening to that. I hope it was interesting. I think just to summarize, kind of the main point or takeaway we have from this is that we need to be asking ourselves the question, is profit and economy the most important thing, and should it be the most important thing when we talk about haze, when we talk about sustainability? Because we know that it's contributing to serious health problems, and like I mentioned before, it's the economic cost of air pollution is huge. So when we talk about protecting the economy, we need to make sure that it's also protecting our future generations. and our own lives for the future. And also, really looking at the true cost of these issues, because we shouldn't just be counting our economic profits when we're considering how much we're paying in terms of healthcare costs and other costs and our lives to the results of air pollution. So that's the purpose of Greenpeace kind of with this campaign. And we have a, sorry, I'm just moving to the next slide. Stuck on this one, I think there was an error. There we go. So we have a petition about this. And of course, if you haven't seen this already, we would encourage anybody to help us by signing this petition, which is demanding that the government enact a Transboundary Haze Pollution Act to address the issue and look into companies that are financing and involved in activities causing burning and deforestation that contributes to haze in particular. So I'll then now jump to the third topic and give some kind of reminder of the issues with our plastic crisis, and also a few updates since the last time I spoke in March. So first, we probably all know in general why plastic is bad and causing a lot of problems. But I just want to give a reminder, because there's also a lot of things that people don't necessarily hear about that are contributing to this plastic crisis. The first reason why I say plastic is so bad is because production of plastic is growing out of control, and we don't have a way to manage it. So you can see in the chart to the right, it's really growing exponentially, and it's expected that plastic production could double within the next 10 to 15 years and triple by 2050. So with this rate, it's extremely scary to think of how we're going to manage the amount of waste that's coming out of plastic production. The second reason is because over 99% of plastic is made from fossil fuels. So it's also linked to oil and gas. So as we need to transition away from fossil fuels, we need to also transition away from plastic, because this actually also has a carbon footprint. And in 2019 alone, plastic production and incineration was estimated to create greenhouse gas emissions that were equal to 189 coal-fired power plants. So there is actually a huge carbon footprint from plastic production, in addition to the amount of waste it's producing. And the third reason is that microplastics are now in everything. It's in our food, our water, our air, soil, blood. It's in breast milk, the human placenta, the Arctic. We have now seen that babies are, for the first time, being born with microplastics in their bodies. And this is really, really scary, because the health impacts of microplastics are still being studied. We already have indications that's very dangerous, but in the past, there were no children that were already being born with microplastics in their bodies. So this is the first time we're going to be seeing what that means for a child later in their lives when they've been exposed to these chemicals in plastics. And in 2022, there was a study of 8 major bottled water brands in Malaysia that found microplastics in all of them. Bottled water is actually one of the places where people ingest a lot of microplastics. So it's another thing that I always encourage people, in addition to not using plastic water bottles because of the waste that it produces for single-use plastics, you shouldn't use them also because you're ingesting higher amounts of microplastics. So it's really important to be using reusable containers for your drinks, for drinking water. And plastic, like I mentioned, contains really dangerous chemicals. It contains hormone-disrupting chemicals and what are called forever chemicals that enter our bodies through many ways, including inhalation, ingestion, and contact with our skin, and are raising serious health concerns, which we don't even know the full impact of, because it's also very hard to find correlations with health effects later on in life. But we do know that many of these chemicals are very concerning. And there was a recent study that found that plastics are made with as many as 13,000 chemicals. 3,200 of them have been identified as chemicals of concern, but many more of those chemicals have actually never been studied, and we don't even know the impact, the health impact, and the toxicity of those chemicals. So this is another reason why I also tell people to be very cautious when eating food in plastic, because even if there are labels saying that it's safe for food, it's likely that there's chemicals there that we haven't studied yet, and we don't know how safe it is. So I'm very skeptical of the safety of eating food and drinks in plastic, especially heating. I will highlight, you should never heat food in plastic, because heating plastic releases more microplastics. And the fifth reason is ecosystem destruction. Of course, you might have seen this one most, we see a lot, but plastic is also killing the ocean. It's ending the lives of millions of animals every year, including endangered species. It's really scary because certain species like sea turtles think that plastic bags are jellyfish and they ingest them. So we're finding more and more animals are actually dying from the ingestion of plastic waste in the ocean, in addition to microplastics that we find in, even another thing is that also in fish, one of the higher sources of microplastics is in seafood, because seafood is now ingesting so much plastic, which is really sad and scary. And the final reason is that plastic pollution is linked to social injustice. So often plastic waste is traded globally and sent to countries with less regulations. A lot of plastic is sent to Southeast Asia and to Malaysia. And that's because it's accepted here. It's still some plastic is legally imported here. And the other problem is there's a huge black market for plastic waste trade. So we're still seeing illegal waste being traded globally and dumped. And it's often dumped in lower income, marginalized communities that tend to have higher rates of cancer and asthma. And often these communities have less resources to seek help to stop this type of horrible pollution and dumping that's often illegal. So next, I want to just highlight a few things that we at Greenpeace we call false solutions, which are the things that the oil and gas industry, which is part of the plastics industry, it's the petrochemical industry, they want us to believe will fix the problem of the plastic waste crisis. And as Greenpeace, we are trying to highlight that what we want to be really clear about what are the real solutions to this crisis and what are the solutions that the industry is trying to distract us with. So the first one is relying on recycling to solve the plastic crisis. Recycling, of course, can be important, particularly for circular materials like metal and glass, which can be infinitely recycled into the same quality material over and over. But for plastic, it can at least delay the material going directly to landfills, but most plastic degrades in quality and can only be recycled once or twice at most. So it's not an actual circular solution in the sense that plastic eventually ends up in a landfill. So we cannot rely on recycling to solve the plastic waste crisis. Also, we know that recycling just hasn't worked in the past. Less than 10% of all plastic has ever been recycled globally. So it's not a solution that's feasible in the world today. And the industry has known this. They have known that plastic recycling will never solve the crisis, and they have tried to hide this and push the problem onto consumers to tell us that all we have to do is recycle and then we won't have any plastic waste, but that's not actually the reality. So we really emphasize that recycling should be one of the last options in a truly circular system. Before recycling, we need to be reusing and refilling our containers and not sending anything to waste. So like I mentioned, we know, and the plastics industry knows, that we can't recycle our way out of this plastics crisis. And focusing on recycling is a way that the industry distracts us from demanding real solutions, like reusing and refilling our containers. And it is possible. There are parts of the world and companies that are implementing these solutions where they allow they use reusable containers. They even have collection points for reusable containers to be dropped off again. And this is what we need to be switching to. People bringing our own reusable containers, but also companies need to offer those solutions for us instead of pushing single-use products onto us. And like I mentioned, recycling puts the responsibility onto consumers and the public when companies need to be taking responsibility for this as well. Another really tricky thing that is often promoted as sustainable now is biodegradable and compostable plastics. The problems with this is that it first perpetuates ongoing single-use and throwaway culture, requiring new resources instead of reusing. And the other thing that many people don't know is that biodegradable and compostable plastics actually can't be recycled, and they contaminate the recycling process. So it's really tricky that we have these products now being introduced and not very clearly, it's not being clearly shared with us what to do with them. And the other problem is that they usually require special facilities to biodegrade or compost, including industrial composting facilities, because they need very specific conditions to actually break down. So we don't have those facilities in most places. So it's really misleading for companies to promote and say they're sustainable now if they're offering a biodegradable plastic, when actually the plastic might end up in a landfill anyway, and it might never break down because of the conditions that it's in. And they still may be releasing harmful chemicals. So just being biodegradable doesn't mean that it's actually healthy or sustainable for the environment, which is really, it's frustrating that companies are now using this to kind of mislead us. And other things that we are seeing more and more right now is solutions being proposed like incineration, pyrolysis, or waste to energy, and chemical recycling and advanced recycling. So we really try to make clear that waste to energy should never be considered recycling or circular. It's also not safe. Burning waste creates toxic ash and poisonous gases, and it causes pollution. And it requires fuel. And some studies have shown that incinerators can even waste more energy than they produce because they constantly need to be burning new material. And they're also perpetuating this single-use throwaway culture where we have to continue creating new products from raw materials and then burning them. So it's really not a solution for our circular system. And these facilities are often very expensive, taking years to build and create a very small number of jobs. Greenpeace has also looked into facilities for so-called chemical recycling or advanced recycling, where they are intending to break down plastic into raw chemicals again to be reused. But we really highlight that, again, this is not recycling, it's not circular, and many of these projects we found are not viable, and many of them don't even have any promise of becoming viable in the long term. So it's another way that the industry is distracting us from pushing for the real solutions that would be circular, like reuse and refill. So yeah, like I mentioned, that we need to push for these real solutions. And this is what I've been talking about when I say circular or reuse and refill. This is the zero waste hierarchy that we're pushing for, where rethinking and redesigning our systems to have a closed loop model is the top priority. And this would allow us to reuse and refill our products primarily, also refuse and reduce unnecessary plastic and packaging. And we see recycling and composting as kind of one of the later steps if we're unable to reuse and refill and redesign our products. Also, composting is when we need to. Well, of course, composting for food is always really, really good, because that prevents methane from. Well, when food waste goes into a landfill, it produces methane. So it's actually really bad to put your food waste into the regular trash. It should always be composted. But then also, this is really focused on plastics in particular. Then repurposing our materials or upcycling and downcycling is another thing that we can do. And of course, ideally, we want to eliminate any type of material going to landfill for no repurposing in any way. And one of the latest updates I'd want to share is on the Global Plastics Treaty, which is happening right now. Their governments are discussing the first global plastics treaty ever. This is kind of a historic moment. UN is leading discussions. There have been already global meetings about this, and just a few weeks ago, a zero draft of a global plastics treaty was released, meaning the first draft text, and governments and companies and civil society are meeting to negotiate the actual final text that's going to come out, hopefully next year. Right now, this process is exciting because it's the first time, but we're seeing that the industry, the plastics industry, is really controlling the narrative and trying to prevent meaningful change from coming out of these discussions. So Greenpeace is pushing for a strong global plastics treaty that will end plastic pollution and cap and phase down plastic production to transition to a low carbon, zero waste and reuse-based economy, and also make sure we look at human rights in the process. So another petition here that I will share also after this, that we would be very grateful if you could sign the petition if you're interested to contribute. And finally, I will just conclude here before I open up for maybe some questions, since I think there might be time. But I'd just like to highlight that we all have a role to play in terms of how we address these problems. I think that government, businesses, and individuals have to be doing something right now to prevent climate change and prevent things from getting worse. One of the biggest things we can do as individuals is vote for climate and make sure we demand from our governments that they pass and implement policies protecting the environment. We also have to make sure that businesses are implementing real solutions and not greenwashing or false marketing and pretending that they are sustainable when they're not actually protecting the environment. And then, of course, as individuals, we need to try our best to change our consumption habits to shift away from single use and push for reusing items and questioning what we really need. And I like to highlight here a few things that individuals can do to make us feel more empowered. Shopping without plastic packaging, shopping, even just starting by refusing plastic bags when you go to the supermarket is one step. And of course, reusing your own water bottles is really a great way to start for people who haven't. Especially saying no to plastic, and particularly for food and drink. Like I mentioned, I would encourage everyone to never store hot food in plastic and not heat up in the microwave anything in plastic. Buy local, of course, that's helpful for the local economy. Eat more plant-based food, say no to meat. Grow your own food if you can. Even in the cities, it's possible to do little things like growing herbs and having small gardens on your patios. Composting, like I mentioned, is really, really important to keep food waste out of landfills. And reusing, repairing, and repurposing what we have. And then questioning what we don't need and not buying things just because they're marketed to us. And finally, I just want to leave with a slide encouraging everyone to get involved if you're not already. I know the Tzu Chi Foundation is already very active on some of these issues, which is amazing. But if you want to support a bit more right now, the two petitions that I mentioned, the Global Plastics Treaty petition and the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act petition, are two petitions that we're really pushing right now to hopefully get enough signatures to pressure our governments to do more. And of course, volunteering and supporting organizations like Greenpeace, Malaysia Vegetarian Society, Zero Waste Malaysia, and others that are working on this, in addition to the Tzu Chi Foundation, are also ways that you can get more involved. And the photos on the right here are some of my photos from the way I shop in KL and in Selangor. There are zero waste shops where I refill my containers and buy things in bulk so that I don't buy any plastic packaging. And that's all. I will stop here.